the Wisdom and Knowledge podcast with host Mark Bozak and Gordon Causey standing in. We'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I cannot tell you what a thrill it is for me, and I'm sure for many of our viewers, that we have on a gentleman, Dr. Robert Malone, who is one of the first names that will come to mind whenever you think about voices that have been speaking out about the insanity we've been experiencing these past 3 years. Dr. Ryan Cole, Dr. Peter McCulloch, for Canadians, Dr. Byron Bridle. There are a number of names out there, but at the top of that list, and certainly always in the top 3, is none other than Dr. Robert Malone, one of the individuals responsible for the invention of mRNA vaccine, this platform. Dr. Malone, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. So let's get into it.
Oh, big time. I'm going to start out I know that most people watching will know your background. I've read through your biography many times over the past 3 years, but you earned your medical degree at Northwestern. You did postdoctoral work at Harvard. From there, you went on to work at the prestigious, world-renowned Salk Institute, where you were you had an epiphany of sorts.
Well, let's just say I wrote the original patent disclosures and have 9 issued patents with me listed as author on RNA vaccines and DNA vaccines. Carrico and Weissman, those that the press pushed as the inventors, have 1 patent on the use of pseudouridine, which does not name or mention mRNA vaccines as an application. So, inventorship is determined by the Patent and Trademark Office, not by journalists and opinion leaders like Z-Dog or whomever.
Oh, amazing. That was one of the questions I wanted to ask, was how many patents you hold on the technology on this platform. So you say it's 9?
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry I don't have my studio cams working, or I'd flip over to the cam that shows all the patents sitting behind me on the wall. But those are some of them.
Okay. Now,
there's 9. I hold about 14, I think, U.S. patents, and then there's all the foreign ones. Okay. Of which 9 specifically relate to mRNA and DNA vaccination.
Okay. Now, how many patents would be involved in total on this mRNA platform? Would it be dozens?
I have no idea, because there's a whole lot of derivative work and composition of matter. And a lot of that has not even been published, or if it's published, it hasn't issued yet. And there's patent battles going on right now between Moderna and BioNTech and Pfizer and the NIH Vaccine Research Center. And it just has devolved into a great big pissing match.
Very good.
And then but to give credit where credit's due, the group in University of British Columbia, I think Arcturus is their current name for their commercial company, also has made a significant contribution into the composition of matter of the lipids in the formulation. And they have a large suite of patents themselves. And supposedly Mr. Trudeau's family is bankrolling that company in part, or as major owners.
What a shock. What a shock.
Yeah, no surprise.
This confluence that's going on between governments and the pharmaceutical industry and the regulatory bodies.
Let's just call it public-private partnerships, which Mussolini would assert as corporatism or fascism.
Well, this is coming to the fore because come this fall, we are being told that there is going to be a new formulation, a new iteration of the COVID quote unquote vaccines that are going to be targeting specific strains that were identified, I guess, back in June. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this new formulation that's coming out? How much was it tested? How public are these results? How an individual such as yourself who's...
Well, apparently the amount of testing is negligible. That's all being grandfathered in. How effective they are, to date, the evidence suggests not very. And evidence demonstrates that by this repeated vaccination, inoculation, I hesitate to call them vaccines, since they don't protect against infection, replication, spread, or death, or disease. None of those are prevented by these products. What I spoke about last summer, I think it's a whole year ago in Texas when I testified in the Senate, was this problem of original antigenic center immune imprinting, which results in a decrease in the ability of a patient to respond to particularly a respiratory virus. This has long been known as a problem in influenza vaccination and in coronavirus vaccination. And the literature was quite rich over a year ago that this problem of immune imprinting or immunosuppression due to repeated vaccination with related antigens was resulting in people not only becoming less effectively protected, but actually more likely to be develop clinical infection, clinically significant infection, disease, and death. And those data have been borne out. They were present quite a long time ago. And Peter Marks acknowledged in one kind of underplayed statement, the FDA official responsible for this whole mess, that immune imprinting did exist. It was measurable. But that he didn't think it was going to be any real problem or clinical significance. It's another case of a government official substituting their belief system for actual data. And this has been a common problem all the way through, as you know. And then that gets translated into these various rather aggressive attempts by UN, WHO, et cetera, and the US government and the British government to censor, defame, suppress, in other ways, block the ability of the public to encounter a narrative other than that which they approve. So the data are quite strong, suggesting that continued repeated inoculations with these products are going to not only result in a relative immunodeficiency relating to this vaccine, a selective lack of or depression of immune response, which, by the way, I warned about this in year one, I think, of the vaccine rollout. I know in year one, using the metaphor or analogy of the physicians who manage allergy, in particular, have a method of repeated inoculation with immunogens. You may know this from your children, for instance, when they get their, quote, allergy shots. What those are for is inducing high zone tolerance. And this is a complicated immunologic phenomena, but basically, your body kind of selectively shuts down immune response when it gets blasted with antigen again and again and again, which is, of course, what's being done. So it was entirely predictable, knowable, but there was, how do I say it, willful ignorance about the data and the literature about this. And unfortunately, for those patients who have fallen so deeply into the narrative that they're at inoculation number 8 or 10 or whatever, the data indicate that they are not only less protected, and this is quite clear, less protected against infection, replication, spread, disease, and death than those that, for instance, have been naturally infected, which the vast majority have very robust immunity and recovered unless they had major pre-existing conditions, tended to recover very rapidly. Those that have been fully compliant with the government advice, let's say, in some case mandates, the evidence is quite clear that they actually have both a selective immunologic deficit in terms of response to this cluster of related coronaviruses that we call collectively SARS-CoV-2, and it's really a continuum with SARS-1. And also, unfortunately, the data are suggesting, this is not definitive yet, but suggesting that these people have a broad immunologic deficit, particularly in their T cell response, and they may be more highly susceptible to some long-term problems involving autoimmune disease and cancer.
I want to go off on a bit of a tangent here, because prior to SARS-CoV-2 popping onto invading everyone's life in March of 2020.
For some of us, it was a little earlier, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Late 2019.
Yeah, I think
there we go. Yeah.
I think fourth quarter 2019 is a safe space to talk about when the virus entered the population.
Right. But before all that happened, there was what is typically referred to as the anti-vax community. And there's a prevailing narrative in the medical community.
Yeah, and that would be, just to say it, that would be a pejorative that has been weaponized by corporate media and various pharmaceutical interests to demean, belittle, and disparage those who were raising concerns about particularly the childhood vaccination schedule.
Right. Well, that is something I wanted to speak to. I wanted to have your expertise on. Is we all know MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, the polio vaccines, this schedule of vaccines that children receive. When we talk about measles, mumps, rubella, we were talking about what used to be referred to in bygone years as so-called childhood diseases. Children would get measles, they would get mumps, they'd maybe get whooping cough, and parents, one of their go-to responses was, if you had 5 children and one child came down with the measles, well, everyone get into bed with Johnny so you can all get it. We can get it all over with.
Yeah, same with chicken pox.
Yes.
So this is yeah, I think I'm following where you're going with this. Tell me if I got it wrong. There are a body of data that are consistent with the drop in childhood mortality and these infectious childhood diseases, notably polio, having preceded the onset of the availability of these kind of mid-century vaccines, which, by the way, are pretty much all continued to be manufactured using those old processes, because there's a strong disincentive to update any manufacturing process once it's licensed, because this is the bureaucracy. As soon as you as a manufacturing company reopen the dossier with the FDA that was used to approve that, then suddenly the FDA has a latitude to make all kinds of points and considerations and try to get you to update it. So I could use the metaphor. I live on a farm. I was rebuilding an old 100-year-old farmhouse. I was going to live in it. The county shut me down, and they said, no, you're going to have to bring it up to present code. And to bring it up to present code, I would have to have all the lumber in it certified as adequately dried and cured and graded. And there's no way, because this building was over 100 years ago, where all the wood was locally cut and milled, and most of it, since it was oak, was hung green anyhow. That there's no way to bring that building up to code. Likewise, these historic vaccines from the mid-century, if you can follow the metaphor, have a lot of really quite antique manufacturing practices and were licensed in a window of time where, truth be told, modern concepts of randomized clinical trials didn't exist. Most of them, so the criticism of Turtles All the Way Down, a book that I strongly recommend to people, is that childhood vaccines were technically licensed based on a null comparator or a proper inactive control. So a double-blinded randomized clinical trial with proper controls. And that's true. None of them are. And part of that is the consequence of these mid-century vaccines like MMR.
Okay.
And many of them were developed by Merck, having basically been grandfathered in at a time when the standards were much lower, the clinical trials were quite small. And then once they existed, then the logic was, well, we can't do a blinded randomized clinical trial with a placebo control because that would put the patients receiving the placebo at risk because they weren't receiving any active vaccine, and therefore it's ethically inappropriate. And then that's the logic that takes us down this road to hell that we're in right now, where we don't actually, as Bobby Kennedy correctly, in my opinion, identifies, we really don't have a baseline. We have everything compared to other things, but that doesn't really allow us to assess the true risks or the true efficacy of any of these things. So, so the poor, I mean, my heart goes out to the young parent now. And just to put a pin in it, I was with my grandchildren on Father's Day. They're 2 and 4 or 4.5. And it's been so long since my wife and I had little ones. I was sitting there just going, my God, I thought dairy farmers had to work hard. Being a young parent has got to be one of the hardest jobs in the world. And now, thinking young parents that are being exposed to this information and the truth about the childhood vaccine schedule and the risks that appear to exist associated with it, having to do with hyperinflammation, brain swelling, and some other things. We don't even need to, I'm not going to go all the way to autism, but autism is certainly in the spectrum of things, right? It's exploding, and so is the use of Roundup in our food and a number of other things which could be contributing factors. And so we can't say it's this, that, or the other thing. It could be all the things above. It could be something completely different. We don't know. We just know it's exploding. But there's no question that we have multiple instances of children having severe adverse events, including cerebral edema, after receiving these simultaneous multiple jabs, which are highly inflammatory. They're pro-inflammatory because they're designed to be pro-inflammatory, and no one has ever tested all of these, let alone have they done an objective test of each individual childhood vaccine against the placebo control for effectiveness and safety. But they haven't ever done the study where they combine them all and compare them to a valid comparator to say, hey, what's the problem if we just jab kids, with all this stuff all at the same time? And so the poor parent that is the thinking person faces this just incredibly burdensome paradox of what I really think is an exemplar of the paradox of being a free living person, of taking personal responsibility, which is the easy path for the young parent is to say, the government told me so, and so therefore that's what I'm going to do, which is what all the pediatricians are jamming down their throats. I've heard story. I heard a story the other day that a child whose parents refused the vitamin K shot at birth, their existing pediatrician would not see that infant anymore, would not allow them to take that infant to their practice, okay? There's such strong financial incentives to pediatricians to have the majority of their cohort, their patients, fully compliant with these various inoculations, that they just don't want to take patients that aren't going to be allow them to be fully compliant. So the parent faces this paradox. Okay, I either go along with what the government says and my pediatrician is happy, but there is this risk that my child will not be as, let's say, intellectually acute as they might otherwise be, or might have other adverse events. Or I can, in the middle of all the responsibilities I already have as a parent, and I'm not a trained physician, right? They're not trained. Typically, the young parent is not trained to evaluate scientific literature independently. And so if they want to take personal ownership and responsibility for the inoculations their child is going to take, then they face this paradox that either way, whatever decision they make, there could be a bad outcome.
Right.
Okay. Could be the child would get a case of a male child. Is it a significant enough possibility? That's something that isn't really super clear in the literature right now because of these various variables that are going on. And so but if the parent says, yeah, take the mumps vaccine together with the rest of the schedule, or some subset of the schedule, and the child develops a symptom of a post-vaccination injury, then the parent is guilty there. And so the young parent is faced with this wicked paradox of whatever they do, it could turn out bad and they're going to have to own it, which I suggest is the paradox of being a free person. It is to be somebody who values freedom and personal autonomy and personal sovereignty is wicked hard, which is why in some, only about 5 to 25% of people actually want to be free. Vast majority of people want to be told what to do. They want to have a daddy figure. And the state is very glad to step in and do that for them. That's what I can say about this in terms of the nuance of does your child take this vaccine or that vaccine or whatever. Hepatitis B at birth, sorry, no. Human papillomavirus prepubertal in a child who is not sexually active, unless they're being exposed to some predatory behavior. That doesn't make sense to me either, for a variety of reasons. And the HPV vaccine is not a fully benign. No drug is without safety risk, right? Water imbibed at sufficient quantities is toxic.
Right.
Any drug is toxic. Here's a fun story relating to this. I'm sure you've all heard about
Dr. Malone.
Yeah.
Jump in for a second. Because we talk about the science and we talk about politics, and it's hard to separate the two often.
Unfortunately, that has become the case.
But in terms of, there's a prevailing narrative that in order for vaccines to be effective, that we need near total compliance. We need everyone taking the MMR vaccines, for example. We'll just fixate in on measles, because if every child doesn't take the measles vaccine, then measles can infect that child, and then because they're not vaccinated and they don't have any antibodies built up against it, that the virus itself can mutate and change, and that change will then affect those good people, good children who got the vaccine, because now it's mutated and can defeat the vaccine generated antibodies that the compliant had, and how.
Right. And so that narrative is promoted. It's promoted by the vaccine industry. Has it been well tested? No. Was it tested in the case of COVID? Were the unvaccinated the ones that were generating the escape mutants? No, it was the vaccinated.
Right.
How were the vaccinated generating the escape mutants? Because the vaccines were far from perfect. They were not sterilizing. How many of these pediatric vaccines are fully sterilizing? Probably in very few, if any. Okay. And so it's a false narrative. In the truth is, so there's a deeper truth, like a lot of these things. One of the problems is the Dunning-Kruger effect, that a lot of these public health bureaucrats think they're smarter than they really are. It's something that we all suffer from. We often overestimate our own intelligence and our own comprehension of the world. So there's a couple of things that you really need to know to cut through all this propaganda. Number one, children have an exceptional ability to resist infectious disease, particularly viral infectious disease, consequent to the development of their thymus. Their thymus is really exceptionally large compared to adults. Thymic involution occurs in your late teens, early 20s, but the young child is like superhuman in terms of their ability to fight off infectious disease, particularly viral infectious disease, okay? And in many cases, these childhood vaccines or these childhood infectious diseases are actually far more severe in adults who have not been previously exposed than they are in children. So what we're really talking about in many cases is trying to keep these viruses away from the grown-ups who have not previously experienced them, okay? Or who have taken a crappy suboptimal vaccine that is not fully sterilized and does not have, is not robust. It does not produce lifelong robust immunity. It's not durable. Okay, the durability is the key concept here. So we jab the kids. We try to keep out the circulating viruses, which are all over the world. And by the time they get to adulthood, they typically have suboptimal immunity because the vaccines are far from perfect. And now they're actually these adults at greater risk of infection and disease, and by the way, more severe disease than they would have been if they'd been naturally infected when they were a little kid. Okay, that's concept number one. You got to get through your brain. This is like vaccinology 1A, which for some reason, most of the internet has not taken vaccinology 1A. No surprise, because this is pretty deep technical stuff.
It is.
Here's the next one that's a little hard. So we're moving up now to vaccinology 101. Okay. Upper division course. So I'll try to go slow.
Please.
Pediatric infectious disease typically circles the globe. Okay. It moves in a wave geographically through different regions. Pediatric infectious diseases do, viruses do. Okay. How come that happens? It makes no sense at all. Why would there be waves of infection that would sweep the world every few years, okay, in the natural state? Why would that happen? The reason is, in order to comprehend that, you have to comprehend the idea of the reproductive coefficient. Remember, we heard all of that about R naught.
Yes.
And the which is the R naught is the baseline reproductive coefficient in the absence of any other intervention in a population. Okay, so what that means is if we're not all locked in our houses, yeah, or taking a vaccine or taking an antiviral or something like that. If a virus is introduced in the population, if you get infected, how many other people will get infected on average from you? That's the R naught. Okay.
Yes.
Is it one? If it's less than one, it will never become an epidemic because it will extinguish. On average, you will pass it to less than one other person. Oop, dead end. Okay.
Right. Anything above one, and you have.
And it gradually moves through the population. And when it gets to like 7 or 14, these are numbers that have been tossed around with Omicron and some of these other variants, then it moves like wildfire. Measles is right up there. It's like 6 or 7, okay? And in a naive population, measles were just ripped through the population. As more and more people become infected in a population and recover from that infection, so natural immunity,
right,
you end up with basically dead-end hosts. If the virus has a reproductive coefficient of 7, and of those 7 people that you, the infected index case, contact, 6 of them have already been infected and recovered, then the reproductive coefficient goes down to 1 or less. Okay? All right. So natural immunity works. That's how it works. Okay. Now comes the kicker. How does that explain virus circulating in pediatric populations all over the world across time? Because what happens is a virus will move into a population like we've all experienced with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2, okay? And at first, it was just a rip snorter. It was infecting everybody, and, all their jibber jabber about the vaccine this or the mask that. It was just noise. It was just highly infectious, and it went through all of us. And unfortunately, it killed some of us, and maybe some of those deaths were the consequence of medical mismanagement, but it happened. And then we got to the point where most of us have been infected. Some of us have immunity from vaccines, but most of us, because the vaccines don't protect from infection, even those that are vaccinated, most of them have had COVID. Okay, so now most people have a robust, broad immunity, again, both cellular and humoral, adaptive immunity against this virus. Okay, and so they can come out with all the new vaccine variants in the world that they want. And I tell you, if they try to test those rigorously, it's going to take forever. It's going to take massive clinical trials, and they're not going to get very good data. Why? Because almost everybody already has immunity, okay? And so they're going to be trying to detect an incremental improvement on what's an already quite robust effect. In order to detect that statistically, the sample sizes are going to be enormous, okay? So I guarantee if they do this, they will not run those clinical trials because they couldn't afford them, okay? We would be talking about hundreds of thousands to millions of people followed up for 6 to 12 months and ideally for 2 years. Okay, that's not going to, and by the way, the cost per patient for that kind of a trial is something in the $10,000 to $20,000 per patient range. Okay, so that gives you a sense of why nobody's ever going to do this. Now, in terms of getting back to the children, what happens when the virus enters a population? Let's imagine it's Brazil and it's a new virus, okay, and it moves into Brazil and it rips through all those poor people in the barrios, including all their children. And there's some significant disease and some children develop birth defects or whatever the symptom is, okay? And then that population has developed natural immunity, and it's functionally, that virus cannot continue to propagate in that environment. And what happens is it's observationally, it becomes quiescent or dormant. It finds an animal reservoir, it circulates in people that are immunocompromised, and it's really crippled. It doesn't have much food. It doesn't have many hosts. But across the street in Ecuador, where it hasn't hit yet, somehow some poor Brazilian goes into Ecuador and interacts with children or whatever, and suddenly it's spreading like wildfire in Ecuador. Okay, and then somebody from Ecuador goes to the South Seas, the South Pacific, and suddenly it's ripping through the South Pacific. And then after a year or 2 years, it's gone because everybody has natural immunity. Okay, can you appreciate what I'm saying? And then from the South Pacific, it goes to Africa. Okay, blah, blah, blah. It circulates the world. Now, why is it not a dead end when it gets back to Brazil? Because the Brazilians have babies. And those babies have not seen that virus before.
Right.
And when the cohort of babies in Brazil gets large enough, it has not been exposed to the virus, then that virus can enter that population and reproduce. And that's what happens is essentially the virus is delayed from entering into a new geographic human population by the time it takes to build up enough birth cohort so that you have enough non-naturally infected individuals that it can sustain replication. And so the hope is, the logic is that, we can intervene in this process by giving people a admittedly suboptimal, but good enough vaccine so that it'll prevent that virus when it comes back to Brazil from ripping through the population. And so that's makes sense to me. Let's do that. Okay, great, super. The problem is that this goes on for decades. And now you have 30, 40, 50 years of children that have grown up getting a half-baked immune response to the virus. Okay? Now, what happens to those people? Now you have a large cohort that's not particularly resistant, fairly resistant. Okay? And then the government is left, beating a dead horse. The government is left with the only option of saying, everybody has got to be vaccinated. We can't allow anybody to not be vaccinated, because if this thing breaks out, if we get enough unvaccinated that we reach that critical mass so we can get circulation, then it is likely that it will enter these people that are suboptimally immune, and it may well be selected for viral escape mutants, just like we've seen with COVID. And the people driving the COVID vaccine resistant mutants are the people basically who either have compromised immune systems or have a suboptimal immune response because they've been given a crummy vaccine that doesn't protect against infection, replication, or spread. And that's how this world works. And what people don't get, hopefully I've been able to communicate this well, is that we are now, with our vaccine policy, living the consequences of this kind of overly optimistic, short-sighted view that we can use technology to, the big lesson here is the hubris of believing that we can do better than nature. Okay? And meanwhile, make a lot of money at it. And become heroes and get Nobel Prizes and all those things that academics live for. And it turns out it doesn't work that well. And that's the paradox. The other paradox is that vaccination, you're right, vaccination really only works well if you're able to generate herd immunity. This is what we're talking about.
Right.
And if the vaccines are not sufficiently potent or durable to maintain a long-lasting herd immunity, then you got a problem, because suddenly you have a relative hole in the armor, a gap that can be exploited by these infectious diseases. And therein lies the rub. And that's that we're now encountering that reality, and the vaccine industry is in denial about it. But hey, there's a former FDA commissioner who now works for a AstroTurf organization funded by pharma, who is now making the rounds with the claim that I am a Russian agent spreading disinformation to destroy and damage the American vaccine industry.
Well,
you know,
in that
buyer
vein,
beware.
Conrad, if I may, пожалуйста. I wanted to, now you're kicking somewhere around the age of 60 right now, I believe.
Yeah, low 60s.
Oh, okay. These are, you know, you just walked us through. I almost feel like I was taking a first year course in immunology to a degree.
Good. That was my intention, but hopefully made it in a way you were able to assimilate it.
Now,
so I have done my job.
I've read a bit about your biography. Back in 1987, you had something of an epiphany involving fatty tissue and how they could be made to express proteins. And your colleagues came up with the idea of a nanolipid particle, and you said put the nanolipid particle in the fatty acids, and we'll see if it'll express.
A little off, but okay, we'll go with it.
Anyway, at that juncture, you're kicking somewhere around the age of late 20s or yeah, right around 30. I'm
28.
guessing.
28.
28. And now we've seen this progression. 30 odd years have gone by.
All the patents have expired. I got one US dollar for all those patents, just to say. Okay.
But
so I didn't make any money off of this.
So I see an evolution. If you were talking to yourself working at the Salk Institute at 28 years of age when that epiphany came to you about this fatty tissue and expressing proteins, what would you say to young Bobby Malone working in that?
I wouldn't call him Bobby because that would piss him off.
Sorry.
Yeah, so this problem of it's a kind of a parallel universe problem, or time travel problem that often gets presented to me, and it usually gets formulated in the structure. Don't you have personal guilt for what you did, and if not, you should. Is usually the way that's structured. And you know, it ranges from that to this being another one of the many ways that I'm a mass murderer. So
I did not.
We live in a thread of time, and I am not the same person I was then. Yeah. The events that transpired after I had these insights and inventions led me to have a nervous breakdown and develop PTSD, which I still carry with me. I was extremely driven to make a mark on the world, to demonstrate my bona fides. One of my personal challenges, particularly back then, was that my parents had disowned me, but my mother had long believed, consequent to some very early IQ testing that I was subjected to at Stanford, that I should be able to win the Nobel Prize. This was, and I can't tell, when I counsel parents about having gifted and talented children, I counsel them to do not put this kind of expectation on them. It's a burden. And so that's who I was then. It's not who I am now.
Right.
I was extremely motivated to try to solve a problem having to do with how RNA gets packaged into retroviruses. And this was just a unintended consequence of that work, unforeseen consequence. But once you have the insight, the idea, the oh shit moment of realizing the implications, or at least some of the implications of what you've done and what you've discovered, you can't make that go away. It becomes part of you. It becomes part of the world. You've brought forth, whether it's the beast slouching towards Bethlehem in the second coming of Yeats or whatever. You can't take it back once it's happened. It's
Pandora's box.
Yeah, it's Pandora's box. Good metaphor. Pandora's box. Once it's open, you can't put the beast back in. You'll recall that in Pandora's box, she didn't even know what all the beasts were. But she managed to close it, I think, before Hope escaped. Was one of them. There was like two things that didn't escape, and Hope was one of them. So how would I counsel myself? It would probably be more pragmatic along the lines of watching out for predatory scientists. I have had a hole in my radar. I mean, we all have our flaws, and I have learned to be very wary of the aw shucks play. The person who plays dumb and exploits, that has been a ploy that has led me to making mistakes and trusting people repeatedly. I have been over trusting. It's one of my flaws in a weird way, but it's also one of my strengths. I don't think you can receive trust if you're not willing to give trust. So I think that a lot of the errors that I made then had to do with intrinsic aspects of my personality that I wouldn't want to give up. So would it have been better if I went quietly into the night rather than putting myself on this trajectory that I'm on? And people don't understand. They're very critical of my having worked with the government. Oh, you must be deep state, and that equates to
I've heard it.
all kinds of evil. I didn't have any choice, frankly. My mentor at the Salk, when I left, told me that he would destroy my career. He would destroy my career. I would never get an NIH grant. And my career trajectory is basically one of trying to find refuge from a cohort of very aggressive kind of scientific mafia types. Eventually he got pushed out of the Salk. He was editor-in-chief of Proceedings of the National Academy. He was one of the most powerful scientists in the United States, head of the Salk Institute. And he got pushed out because of over 10 years of Me Too sexual harassment complaints. And finally it caught up with him, and Science magazine did an expose. But he still surreptitiously runs the Salk through a surrogate. Extremely powerful. And he said I'd never get an NIH grant, and by God, I didn't. In the world of academia, and as a research scientist in the kind of molecular biology, molecular virology space, there aren't many people. You can work for startups, which I did a fair amount of, and I started some. After the planes hit the towers, the startup I was working with creating, called Inovio, based in San Diego now. They're still operating. Was then a Norwegian company, and the Norwegian investors pulled back because they thought the United States was too unstable. And I was left wondering how to pay my mortgage and feed my children and my wife. And a friend at the Department of Business and Economic Development in the state of Maryland who had helped me find money for a startup, which the University of Maryland then forced me to give back. That's another whole story in my history. And he said, hey, there's this new company up in Frederick, Maryland, and I can get you a job there. And so I took this job with this new co called Dyneport Vaccine Company at the time when they had just won what's called the Prime Systems contract for all biodefense products for the Department of Defense. And this was right after the anthrax attacks. And so suddenly biodefense was booming. Just a sec, I gotta kill this. It's Charlie Kirk trying to call. I took that job because it's all I had. Yeah. And that thrust me into the middle of the intelligence community, the biodefense enterprise, the Department of Defense. Little did I know, as I was getting brought into Dyneport through corporate in Reston, Virginia, I just didn't get it. There were all these huge burly guys all moving through induction at the same time in the corporation. Well, it turns out Dyneport is one of the two companies that runs mercenary armies in the United States. And they happen to have captured the contract for all these biodefense products. And I was going to work for them at a time when they were just barely out of an office trailer. So that's how come I know who I know and all that I know, and all that was basically, I was in a desperate spot. I had to feed my family, and I took the job that I could get. And because I certainly couldn't go back to academe, because I had destroyed my academic career by blowing the whistle on Jim Wilson over the Jesse Gelsinger death from overdosing with adenovirus. So all of this jibber jabber that I'm an evil being because I've worked in this industry, it's just, I think that a lot of it is intentionally weaponized. And in the Substack, and I'm gonna call out the name rwmalone.md.substack.com. In some of my recent essays, I've been going through the latest data that's really emerging quite rapidly about the surveillance state and the censorship industrial complex, as Matt Taibbi calls it. And all the way back, today's essay I put out was about Edward Snowden. I did two about the Snowden disclosures. One of them based on a series of articles that Glenn Greenwald had published in, was it 2014? After the Snowden releases, that talked about the infrastructure that the state, and particularly the UK, had set up to demean, disparage, censor, etc., individuals that would speak against the narrative. And I'm one of many case studies in how this has been run.
Well, if I can jump in, not to interrupt your stream of consciousness, because it's amazing, but there's a tendency, I think, among the general population to place individuals such as yourself, and certainly the scientific medical community, there's a tendency for people to think that you're divorced from normal human failings, that there's this superhuman quality to someone in the scientific medical field.
Interesting way to frame it. Because that's the Church of Scientism has actively developed that thesis. And to that end, just today broke about an hour ago, the subcommittee on the coronavirus investigations in the House has released its report on the suppression of information about the origin of the coronavirus, and particularly the role of Tony Fauci in terms of the Wuhan lab. We saw the cult of personality, I think is the technical term to use in a political science sense, that has been built around this pseudo priesthood of this what Jill and I, my co-author and wife of 44 years that helps write the Substack, argue is truly a religion. It has become the religion of the government, scientism.
Yeah. And to keep that metaphor going, you somewhat fall. You're nailing the thesis to the cathedral door. You're Martin Luther.
I'm a heretic.
Yeah,
I have been a heretic for a long time, probably consequent to, in part, having been through these personal traumas.
Yeah.
Of coming to grips with the truth of big science, which is ugly. I mean, it's basically a mafia.
Yeah.
And it's like a mafia.
There was a question.
Go ahead.
There was a question Mark and I were talking about. I'll throw it at you. With respect, and this is like, the general population, we're filled with pseudoscience. There are internet experts on everything. And one of the concerns being promulgated around is that we could be vaccinated by proxy in a fashion rather than by injection, that this mRNA platform could somehow enter the food supply. I find this impossible.
Okay, let me comment on this, because I talked about this quite a bit. Actually, my wife and I were the ones that led the first article, published the first article on the use of mRNA in animals. And then Peter McCullough picked it up and other people picked it up. And most of the people that picked it up don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's just kind of put a stake in that particular vampire.
Okay.
For sure, absolutely. Merck has been given by USDA and FDA the same kind of a pass, in a sense, as the emergency use authorization.
Mm-hmm.
The development of custom mRNA vaccines for swine. And here's the technical side of that and the justification for it. And just to back up a minute, who's an advocate for mRNA vaccines in animal health? The answer is it's Big Ag. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why does Big Ag care? Because Big Ag has a problem. Industrialized animal farming, in order to get their profit margins, requires very dense populations of food animals. And the pig industry, porcine, swine, whatever you want to call it, and chickens are the two exemplars. Okay. Now, chickens are cheap enough that what happens right now is I don't know if you've ever seen a chicken barn. I used to have some when we lived in North Georgia. We turned them into horse barns. But a modern chicken barn is an amazing protein factory, frankly. It's totally inhumane. It is tightly scheduled. The margins on price per pound of the meat that's produced are pennies. They're shaving pennies all the time. They have put the farmers in a horrible position where basically they're indentured servants to Purdue or whoever the chicken manufacturer is. And they have to use the manufacturer's feed. They have to use their chicks. They have to sell to the manufacturer. The manufacturer basically owns the chickens. And they're just put in this treadmill of being indebted, typically a couple $1 million to set up those barns. And from the point of view of the big corporation that controls all this, if they have an outbreak of, say, avian flu, their best solution is to just kill the flock. Right. Mm-hmm. So they'll come through and they'll just wipe out every chicken in a chicken barn. And they dig pits, their burial pits. They dig a big pit and throw the chickens in there. together with some powdered lime and cover it up and be done with it. In the case of pigs, that's harder. And pigs have higher value per animal on the hoof. And so and yet they have this problem of circulating viruses in these intensive feedlot environments. Because the pigs aren't like out grazing in the grass, on 40-acre parcels. No, they're all jammed into a dark barn in tight quarters, and it is ugly as anything. So if you get an infectious disease starting to circulate in those very inhumane conditions, it'll rip through that barn and it will evolve quite rapidly. And so what Merck developed is a portfolio of tech where they go into your farm and your swine barn, and they draw blood on a bunch of the pigs, and they characterize using genetic analysis, nucleic acid analysis, the spectrum of viral pathogens and other pathogens that exist within that swine herd. And then they develop a custom vaccine for your barn, for your swine herd. Okay. And then they go through and they vaccinate all the pigs using jet injection or whatever it is they do. So each farm or region gets a custom vaccine. And there's no way to do that other than with the mRNA tech. It's one of the powers of the technology because you can go direct from genetic sequence to vaccine.
Right.
And so that is absolutely happening in pigs. And no, they don't have to disclose which pigs. No. And yes, you may be eating pork from mRNA vaccinated pigs. Is it being done in cattle? No, not yet. Okay. And I have many friends in the both dairy and beef industries that are concerned about the growing push to try to implement this kind of tech in their populations. And they're very resistant to it because they know that if the general population, that mRNA vaccine technology has such a black eye now that if people hear that it's going to be deployed in their beef, then the demand for beef is going to crash, or the demand for grass-fed organic beef is going to skyrocket. Wouldn't be a bad thing. So that's where things stand with that. There is absolutely an active interest in finding some way to aerosolize genetic vaccines for chickens. Because the problem with the chickens is you can't afford a vaccine that costs any more than a couple of pennies. It's just the economics don't work out. And so they want to be able to spray it in the mist. All the chickens would breathe it in and get vaccinated. That is aspirational. We're not there yet, anywhere close.
What about I want to ask you something. What about in microgreens? There is a company out there that there's videos out, and whether you know if it's true or not, that this certain company is putting the mRNA technology in microgreens. Have you heard of that?
Okay, so what you've just transitioned from is animal-based vaccination, genetic vaccination.
Yeah.
As the animal being the endpoint, the recipient of the vaccines, to a concept that has been out there for probably at least 30 years, largely pioneered by Charlie Arnson, who I used to know. I've seen him talk about, he used to go on and on and on about using bananas for growing vaccines because bananas are all clonal. And that didn't work out. There is there is a long, rich history of small startups hyping the idea of using plants to manufacture vaccines. And I've seen it through my entire career, and every one of those companies has failed. Now, the CIA through DARPA did fund a couple of companies to develop tobacco-based vaccine manufacturing. Why tobacco? Because so much is known about tobacco and growing tobacco and tobacco genetics and tobacco manipulation and blah, 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 that it was a ready-built tech to introduce new proteins, express new proteins, and then grow those tobacco plants in greenhouse environments. And I've been to those greenhouses, great big, huge manufacturing facilities that are like, how do I put it? A Northern California pot grower's wet dream. They harvest the tobacco, put it through a grinder, a processor, and then extract the proteins out that they've genetically engineered in there, and then notably use them for building influenza vaccines, which don't work very well because plants don't fold proteins the same way that humans do, and they don't glycosylate them the same way, put sugars on them in the same way. So this is also the problem with the Novavax technology, which I also know a hell of a lot about, involving a caterpillar virus called baculovirus and caterpillar cells. And I actually, for a long time, had a client that was actually growing proteins in caterpillars using baculovirus. The system is amazing because the caterpillars build up so much fat, and you can make proteins that will require a lot of fat in their environment to fold properly. And so this is the Novavax product that everybody had so much hope for because it would be an alternative to the genetic vaccines, not just mRNA, but yeah, also the adenovirus.
Okay.
Remember, we had 2 other vaccines earlier on that were genetic.
Chimpanzee adenovirus.
Right.
That was AstraZeneca, was it not?
Yeah. And also J&J.
Right.
And the J&J tech actually comes from Crucell, which came from Inderverma's lab at the Salk Institute from the senior postdoc when I was there in the lab. So it all kind of comes, all the same idea, has the same root. So the problem with Novavax is that to compensate for the fact that their proteins are typically not very immunogenic and not properly folded and glycosylated because they're coming out of caterpillar cells, you have to inject people with a lot more protein and use a powerful adjuvant. Adjuvants are intrinsically inflammatory, and a higher dose of the antigen is also intrinsically inflammatory. And oh, by the way, the antigen is called foreign spike, virally encoded spike, or genetically vaccinated spike. Spike is bad. And so Novavax has a lot of the same adverse event profile that the other spike-based vaccines have. So that's just the hard truth of vaccination. And the other hard truth about the vaccine industry is that coming up with a halfway decent vaccine is actually wicked hard. It takes a lot of time to do it properly. It takes a decade. It takes billions of dollars for the reasons I was talking about, the clinical trials, if nothing else. There's a hell of a lot of failures. And bizarre things that you didn't expect, like with the rotavirus intussusception, which, by the way, the rotavirus vaccine now also causes intussusception, just not quite as high as the one that got rejected. What is intussusception? It's when your bowel, and typically since rotavirus is a problem of little kids, it's when your bowel kind of involutes, it slips inside itself. And when it does that, okay, so the outside part, you can think of a really flexible rubber hose, and you can push part of the rubber hose into the other part of the rubber hose. And when that happens in your bowel is then it starts swelling and it blocks that off. And you end up with something that, as a horse owner, I know all about, which is colic. Horses die. One of the most common causes of death in horses, because they have a primitive gut, is they get a blockage or a twist. And that's kind of what intussusception is, and it kills little kids. And why a vaccine would cause this is still largely speculative, but the truth is that they do. It's one of those things that no one necessarily could have predicted, maybe if they'd done better preclinical studies, but they found it out in the clinical trials. And that's a great example of why you need time to test these things before you deploy them on the whole human population. because of these unforeseen consequences, or what the intelligence community would call blowback.
Collateral damage.
Yeah, that's a very unkind way to put it. So that developing a new vaccine is wicked hard. Most of the easy targets have already been taken.
Right.
So they're left picking away, the venture capitalists, we call it the low-hanging fruit. Most of the low-hanging fruit has been harvested.
Right.
And so now they're picking the stuff that's way up in the tree, hard to get at, and hard to solve the associated problems, which are the ones that are even more requiring more diligence, more time, more rigor.
And instead,
but instead, they built this huge edifice wherein nobody gets held accountable for anything. Nobody can be legally challenged. They're all indemnified. It's obscene. It's totally counterproductive. And somehow it needs to stop. And I don't know how it's going to stop unless somebody like Bobby Kennedy gets elected that is proper pissed off and understands all this, because most of Congress, as you probably well know, is in the pocket of pharma.
Big time.
How does he get elected? How does Bobby Kennedy get elected if he's running as a Democrat? I'm with you 100%. You know what I mean?
So I'm privileged in, and I haven't endorsed his candidate. I have candidacy. I've had people that are pushing. I consider him a friend. I'm going to go to a rally of his in Memphis this Friday, just by way of full disclosure. I was at his original kickoff in Boston. But there are many polls, which are those that are public, are largely being suppressed. Here's Charlie Kirk again. I got to. Hey, Charlie, I'm on a podcast.
You were talking about Bobby Kennedy.
There are numerous polls that show that he is a very strong are showing that within the Democratic Party, he is strongly outpolling Biden.
Yeah.
Which is like saying, he's strongly outpolling John Fetterman. How Oz lost to Fetterman is a topic for political scientists or election integrity people to examine for the next couple decades. But
everyone will remember, though, that when Bernie Sanders challenged Hillary Clinton for the
2020.
No, 2016.
Oh, 2016. Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
Nomination. And even Donald Trump would comment on this. I don't know what the thing is. Bernie keeps winning. He keeps winning, and they say he has no chance because of
exactly.
So delegate system.
So this is and it's the you now are to the point where the corruption of the corporate media and the synergism between corporate media, the intelligence community, and the administrative state has resulted in them acting in lockstep. But I'm not endorsing him. Okay,
no, I know that. Yeah, we're not either. We're just
the polls are suggesting that Kennedy is breaking out. And maybe that's a consequence of Biden being an extremely weak candidate, and the speculation.
Well, wouldn't the DNC just put Biden or whoever, Newsom, whoever in there, and not even give him a talking platform?
Newsom,
what do you think?
The speculation is it'll be Newsom.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's going to be quite a knockdown, drag out, and a lot of there's a strong. These names, Republican and Democrat, they seem such anachronisms now, like left and right.
Thank you.
Just doesn't mean anything anymore.
No.
Is Trump going? Is the are the forces that we identify with the Democratic Party going to be sufficient? The current Democratic Party. And the current Biden administration going to prevail in their apparent objective of destroying Trump's ability to be a viable candidate. What the polling's suggesting is that RFK Jr. is taking a significant bite out of both sides. You know, how do you game that? How does that play out? You mentioned Bernie. There's a significant fraction of Jill calls them granola heads of the kind of old school liberal, quote unquote, or progressive Democrats, often younger, the Bernie bros type, that got really pissed off at the Democratic establishment by what they did with Bernie. Not that Bernie in his afterlife is earning their trust, but there's a large dissatisfied, disaffected group of a Democratic base that apparently sees RFK Jr. as a viable option, and a substantial fraction of conservatives, and I use that term intentionally rather than Republicans, that see RFK Jr. as the best of the lot. And so we're back again with many cohorts kind of thinking that they're going to have to go for an imperfect candidate that's better than the other options. And RFK Jr. does appear to have amazing momentum, is blowing through a lot of the firewalls, and is a different kind of candidate. He is a kind of an idealist philosopher. And my biggest concern, to be frank, is he is not a manager. I know him well. Children's Health Defense is a textbook example. Bobby is a lawyer. He's a good lawyer. He knows a lot about the government.
But he's not an organizer.
But he is not a manager. Can he surround himself with adroit managers? And will he listen to them? Those are the big questions as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Is his heart in the right place? Is he mostly honest compared to the rest of the landscape? Yes. Would I like to see Ron DeSantis polling a lot stronger? Hell yes. But if wishes were fishes, there would be no starvation.
Well, I find you and I are in the same generational area. And so you'll remember the last time where there was a viable candidate contending against a sitting president running for re-election was in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was the sitting president running for re-election. And it's almost an unwritten rule that you don't run against a sitting president. If you're a legitimate viable candidate, you wait your turn. But Teddy Kennedy went all the way to the convention and refused to release his delegates ahead of the convention, even though he didn't have the delegate count to win. And now we're in a similar situation with another Kennedy, with another sitting president, and Ted Kennedy's line of time.
There are scenarios war gamed out where the whole thing gets thrown to the House.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
This is okay. So I know some of the people that are deeply embedded in the campaign quite well. Consider them friends. And Bobby shared with me last summer that he was really considering running. And then one of the individuals visited our farm here and showed me the polling. And that was being done surreptitiously, and asked me what I thought Bobby should do. And my answer was, from a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint, I don't think he has any choice. He has to run, despite the fact that he's going to be at significant risk of assassination. I think that he really doesn't have any other ethical choice, because things are so bad, they're so messed up, and he may be the only viable option to bring a lot of these issues into the awareness of the, let's say, persuadable middle, and to enable some sort of national dialogue about these things that we're not allowed to talk about.
Right. You've said repeatedly, you haven't formally endorsed him. However, the language you're using certainly seems you're leaning in that direction. How reticent are you to make a formalized declaration because of the smear attacks that you have been subjected to over the last 3 years?
Some of which have come from a member of the board of directors of Children's Health Defense.
Yeah.
Has been one of the leading attackers.
Okay.
Well, one thing that I want to tell you about is, because I used to live in Phoenix, right? And I go to these Children's Health Defense. I went once to one of the events in Phoenix, and you know what it was? It was a Trump rally. Nothing to do with standing, like, that's what I love about Europe, is that they went all out. Canada went all out. This turned into Trump 2024 rally. And this was in 2021, and it was put on by Children's Health Defense. Now, obviously, they have no say in who comes down there, but it had nothing to do with standing against it.
CHD has a lot of issues, and one of them is it's very provincial in the sense that it's decentralized. And there's a lesson in that for all of us that are fans of decentralization, including me, which is that things can easily get balkanized and devolve into petty local politics. So Bobby doesn't like to get down in the weeds with that kind of stuff. As a consequence, it flourishes.
Right.
In part because of, I'm being quite frank, let me put it this way. One of the things that I have most feared and most resisted throughout the COVID crisis, as the attention that has come towards me has increased, is the cult of personality. And there are other physicians that are self-described leaders that fully embrace the cult of personality, are busy trying to fundraise off of it, and hawking their book all the time, and presenting themselves as heroes and blah blah blah. I guess I had enough political science as an undergraduate to know that there are dragons down there, and that is surely one of the roads to hell. And there is a very strong cult of personality around Bobby. Of course, he's a Kennedy. He's good looking. That comes with all kinds of complications and burdens. The sycophants, the competitiveness for his attention, a whole lot of kind of distracting noise that gets in the way of business, doing the stuff that needs doing. Right. And I'm afraid CHD has had a chronic problem with those kinds of issues, both in the United States and Europe.
Right. You know what? We have been going on for over I think about an hour and a half, Dr. Malone.
Yeah, we really appreciate this.
We've covered so much, and I get the feeling we could go on for another 2 or 3 hours.
And real quick, Robert,
real
quick, I just want to tell a story about me, because my dad was a pharmacist growing up. So there was 4 years where I worked at one of the major chains as a clerk, and then I was grandfathered in as a tech. And we used to have lists that we would call and try to deceive, patients and say, would you like to take this medicine? And it's obviously something they weren't taking anymore, and just for profits. So, and I'm big into, and I assume that you are, I'm big into eating healthy and, big into
Yes.
organics and all that. And I know all about
And also big
Monsanto and all
into acting with integrity.
Yeah.
And the pharmaceutical industry is a prime example of a culture that has lacked integrity for decades.
Yeah.
Well, at least going back to thalidomide. A question for you.
You could argue going back to Rockefeller,
Sure.
destroying the existing medical infrastructure in the 20s.
Amen.
Thank you.
A question for you. I don't know whether you're aware, but I'm Canadian, and we are having winding its way through our legislative process right now.
Oh, I feel so sorry for you poor souls. You have been captured by the World Economic Forum without them firing a shot.
Thank you.
Big time.
Thank you.
And now in their sites, they have the alternative medicine, the organic, the homeopathic industry, put whatever lifestyle medicine, put whatever label on it you want. But there's talk of restrictions being placed on natural.
Yeah, that's gonna run into Foster Colson and his whole juggernaut. That's gonna be fascinating to watch that play out. And I just wanted to note that Krista Friedland apparently is now the deputy prime minister, and I'm sure at some point to ascend to the higher office when Mr. Trudeau goes to his WEF rewards of some kind, just like Jacinda Ardern did. My heart goes out. I have so many Canadian friends, Byron Bridle being, of course, a notable one, and others that I'm not even allowed to talk about because of the harassment that they've received from the government as physicians.
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. It's deeply troubling. It's a source of deep sorrow for me, and amazingly perplexing how this could happen to what I had always known as kind of a simple, kind-hearted, good people. Some few know that I once took first for a Percheron filly in the Royal Canadian Winter Fair. We used to breed Percheron, and had many friends in the Canadian agricultural community.
Yeah.
And because a lot of people that have drafts are dairy farmers.
So you've probably been to the Canadian National Exhibition, the CNE.
No, I've only been to the Winter Fair.
Okay.
But what happened with the truckers was a wake-up call for the world.
That the truckers were the most amazing. That was the most uplifting, and it was so dissatisfying to see the manner in which Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, and the political establishment.
Yeah, no, the whole thing is obscene, and they're going to completely get away with it. It's very discouraging.
You put out a video, maybe it's over a year ago now, talking about mass formation psychosis, something a colleague of yours in that field, in the field of psychiatry, psychology.
Yeah, Matthias Desmond.
Yes, and you ran it up a high flagpole and put out an amazing video.
And then I got shot for doing so.
You get shot for doing everything now.
Good point.
Yeah, pretty much. They say if you stick up, if the nail sticks up, it's going to get hammered down.
Yeah.
But what I mean, there were infiltrators, paid infiltrators that disrupted the situation in Canada, and I've heard again and again and again that those were not Mounties; those were foreign troops.
foreign troops. There were individuals attached to the Liberal Party of Canada who had individuals dressed up, fully masked and identity cloaked, waving Confederate flags and such.
Right. Yeah, the whole rat fucking false flag stuff. And one of the people that frankly Peter McCullough used to employ to handle his social media, that was one of the early attackers of mine, has been traced to disrupting both that protest and the American trucker protest.
And this goes back, they did in the Vietnam War era
Yep.
as well.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
It's old hat. But
Yep.
Dr. Malone, what's in the immediate immediate to midterm coming up for you? Or do you have events? Are you writing a book, which you should, if you have?
We are working on, so the Lies My
Your
Government
Substack.
Told Me a Better Future Coming. I just got a royalty check for up to last December, which was very gratifying. My wife was happy. We're not going to be rich. We're not going to buy a new car, but it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. We're working on a couple of them. One of them is very much about fifth generation warfare and the psyops that have been deployed on us. But frankly, putting out 1 to 2 Substack essays a day is demanding. Coming out with new content that people want to read and listen to, and writing it in a way that they find entertaining and educational, and engaging, is not a trivial task. The books that we're working on are basically going to be compilations of our Substack, and it's the Substack that buys the hay and feeds us and buys the diesel and everything else. It's our only source of income now. So there are those that speculate that I have wealthy donors that are showering me with money, and that is absolutely not true. We get our money the old-fashioned way. We earn it day after day after day. But the Substack now, we're typically running at about 10 million views per month.
Wow.
And between 300,000 and 500,000 per day. And with a little over 300,000 subscribers and almost 14,000 paid subscribers.
Very good. Well, I will encourage all our viewers, everyone watching this.
We'll put the link on the bottom.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. So Substack is the main thing. Malone Institute, which is not the Malone Foundation. It's not there to support me. Is another one. So you can find maloneinstitute.org.
Okay.
And on that, we have larger pieces, documents, and I think what is still, it absolutely was the first and what is still the definitive Excel spreadsheet of all of the World Economic Forum Young Leader trainees, and where they are, what industry they're from, all that kind of, what their background was and when they graduated. A lot of that kind of stuff at maloneinstitute.org. So those are the two main things, plus the book. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much. We really appreciate this.
Okay.
God
Be good.
All right.